My name is Sarah Brennan, and I am 39 years old. 8 months ago, my parents threw themselves a retirement party at the Riverside Country Club in Hartford, Connecticut. They rented the banquet room. They hired a caterer. They invited 120 people, colleagues, neighbors, church friends, my father's golf buddies, my mother's book club, cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. They had a slideshow. They had a cake with both their faces on it. They had a band that played the kind of music that people my parents' age request when they want to feel young for an evening. They sent me an invitation 6 weeks in advance. Cream-colored envelope, my name written in my mother's handwriting, a card inside with gold lettering that said "Join us as we celebrate the next chapter." There was a reply card. A stamped envelope for returning it. I held that invitation for a long time. I turned it over in my hands and I looked at my mother's handwriting and I thought about what it meant that she had written my name carefully on an envelope and expected me to show up. Then I thought about a gymnasium in Charlottesville, Virginia, 11 years ago, on a May afternoon when I walked across a stage in a cap and gown and looked out at 2,000 people and found a section of empty seats where my parents were supposed to be. I put the invitation back in its envelope. I wrote one sentence on the reply card. I put it in the stamped envelope and I mailed it back. The sentence I wrote was, "I'm so sorry, I can't make it." No explanation. No excuse. Just the same energy they had given me 11 years ago, returned to sender in a cream-colored envelope with a stamp they had provided. Before we get into this, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to the retirement party. Not to the reply card. But to a house in West Hartford, Connecticut, where I grew up as the middle child of 3, which is its own particular experience that anyone who has lived it will recognize immediately. My older brother Patrick was the firstborn, and the firstborn in my family received the particular attention that firstborns receive in families where attention is a limited resource distributed according to an invisible hierarchy that nobody talks about, but everyone understands. Patrick was smart and sociable and good at sports and easy to be proud of. My younger sister Meg was the youngest, and the youngest received the particular tenderness that youngest children receive because they are the last version of the baby that the parents will ever have. Meg was sweet and pretty and a little fragile, and my parents wrapped her in the particular protectiveness that fragile youngest children attract. I was the middle. I was fine. I was capable and independent and didn't require management and got good grades without being reminded and made friends without intervention and generally handled my own business with a self-sufficiency that my parents interpreted as not needing them and that I experienced as not being needed by them, which are the same situation from 2 different angles and feel completely different from the inside. My parents, Tom and Linda Brennan, were good people in the way that people can be good in the broad public sense while being insufficient in the specific private sense that their children required. My father was an engineer. My mother was a school administrator. They were educated, functional, financially stable, respected in their community. They went to Patrick's lacrosse games and Meg's dance recitals, and they showed up for the moments that required showing up for those too, and they were simply, consistently, not quite tuned to the frequency of my existence. This is not a story about cruelty. I want to say that up front because cruelty is easier to explain and easier to receive, and what I experienced was something harder to name, the particular damage of being overlooked rather than attacked, of being the child who was fine rather than the child who was seen. You can spend years recovering from cruelty. You can spend decades wondering if you imagine the other thing. I did not imagine it. And I spent years wondering anyway. That's the middle child experience in a house where attention is not evenly distributed. You question your own perception because nobody is doing anything wrong exactly. They're just doing less. And less is hard to name and hard to prove and leaves you with a particular kind of quiet wound that you carry without quite knowing how to describe it to anyone. I described it eventually to a therapist in my early 30s who was the first person I had ever spoken to who gave it a language. She said, "You were parentified in your self-sufficiency. They relied on your low-maintenance nature rather than building the relationship." I said, "Is there a word for that?" She said, Emotional neglect. I sat with that for a long time. It did not feel dramatic enough to deserve that term, and it did not feel like nothing, and I decided eventually that terms exist for a reason, and the reason is to help people locate their experience in something recognizable. I located mine. But I am getting ahead of myself. Back to West Hartford. Back to the house where I was fine and capable and independent and consequently largely invisible in the specific ways that matter most when you are growing up. I was a good student. Not the best in my class. Patrick was the class valedictorian, which my father brought up with the frequency of someone who considered it a personal achievement, which in some way I suppose it was. But I was consistently in the top 10%. I worked hard and I was organized and I genuinely enjoyed learning things, which is a quality that serves you well academically and tends to be noticed by teachers, and not particularly by parents who are already distributing their attention across the more visible needs in the household. I had a teacher in 10th grade named Mr. Alvarez who taught AP History and who noticed me in the way that certain teachers notice certain students, not because of performance alone but because of something in the quality of the thinking. The way questions get asked, the connection being made between ideas. He told me in November of that year that I should think seriously about college and what I wanted to study and where I wanted to go because I had options I might not be fully aware of. I was 15 years old and a teacher was telling me I had options I might not be aware of, and when I went home and told my mother, she said, "That's nice, honey," and went back to whatever she was doing. This is the sentence I remember most clearly from my childhood. "That's nice, honey." It was her response to a range of things I told her. It was not a dismissal exactly. It was the response of someone whose bandwidth was elsewhere and who acknowledged the signal without receiving its content. I applied to 12 colleges in my senior year. I did it myself, the research, the applications, the essays, the financial aid forms. My parents signed where signatures were required and provided financial information where that was required and otherwise were not involved in the process. This was not because they were against higher education. It was because Patrick had required their active involvement in his applications 4 years earlier, struggling with essays and needing guidance through the process. And they had helped him extensively, and the experience had created the impression that college applications were something you helped with when children needed help. I did not appear to need help. I did not appear to need help with most things. This appearance, which I cultivated because needing things that were not forthcoming is its own kind of pain that you learn to avoid, was accurate in the technical sense and completely misleading in the actual sense. I got into the University of Virginia with a merit scholarship that covered 60% of tuition. It was the best school I applied to and the one I most wanted to attend, and when the acceptance letter arrived I called out for my mom, and she came to the kitchen, and I showed her the letter, and she hugged me and said she was proud of me, and then she said she had to finish dinner. My father was told at dinner. He said congratulations and asked about the scholarship amount, and said that was good and passed the potatoes to Patrick. I drove to Charlottesville in August with my car packed to the roof and my mother standing in the driveway in the particular posture of parents watching children leave, a little sad, a little proud, a little uncertain what to do with their hands. She cried a little. I hugged her and I told her I loved her and I meant it. My father shook my hand. He told me to work hard. I told him I would. I drove away. At college, I became the person I had been trying to become in a house that didn't have quite enough room for me to become it. I studied psychology, which interested me in the same way that Mr. Alvarez's history class had interested me. Not because I needed to understand it for a test, but because it illuminated things about human behavior that seemed genuinely important to understand. I had friends. I had a social life. I had a roommate named Becca who is still one of my closest friends 20 years later, and who is one of those people who shows up for everything and who has made up for every empty seat my family left over the years without knowing she was doing it. I called home every week. I talked to my mother mostly. The calls were pleasant and surface level and followed a consistent format. How is school? How is food? Have you met any nice people? Any word from Patrick? Always any word from Patrick, as if my news was the preamble and Patrick's news was the subject, even when Patrick was not on the phone, even when the call was supposedly about me. I stopped mentioning it. I stopped hoping the calls would be different. I poured myself into my work, my friends, my growing understanding of myself as a person separate from the family that had half-formed me and left me to finish the job myself. If you've ever been the child in your family who always had to figure things out alone while watching your siblings get the help you needed, drop a fire emoji in the comments. And if you think my parents are going to regret missing my graduation, type karma. Junior year, I declared a double major in psychology and education. My advisor, a woman named Dr. Pamela Rhodes, who would become the closest thing I had to an academic mentor, told me it was ambitious and asked me why I wanted both. I told her I wanted to work in school counseling, specifically with adolescents who were falling through the cracks of school systems that were good at identifying obvious need and not good at identifying quiet need. She looked at me with the particular attention of someone hearing something personal inside a professional answer. She said, "That sounds like something you know something about." I said, "Something like that." She said, "Good. That's the best reason to go into a field. When it comes from something you understand from the inside." It does. I have worked as a school counselor for 14 years. Every year I look for the quiet ones. The self-sufficient ones. The ones the teachers describe as fine, doing well. No concerns. Those are the ones I keep an eye on. The children who are fine are sometimes the ones who most need someone to look. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Senior year arrived the way senior years arrive, with the simultaneous feeling that 4 years had passed instantly and that you had lived an entire life inside them. I was 22 years old and I was about to graduate from a university I had chosen myself, having paid my way through it with a combination of the merit scholarship, loans, and money I had earned from part-time work throughout. I had maintained a 3.8 GPA. I had been elected vice president of the Psychology Honors Society. I had completed 2 semesters of student teaching at a local middle school where my cooperating teacher wrote in my evaluation, "One of the most naturally gifted student educators I have worked with in 22 years. Graduation was on a Saturday in May. The ceremony was held on the university grounds, outside in the May sunshine, the kind of day that makes everyone look like they are living inside a photograph. I had sent my parents the details 4 months in advance. Date, time, parking information, the registration link for family seating. I had followed up twice, once in March, once 3 weeks before the ceremony. Both times my mother had said, "Of course we'll be there, don't worry about it." I bought extra tickets for family seating. I had them. I had arranged them. I had put them in an envelope with a handwritten note of the meeting location. The morning of graduation, my phone rang at 7:15. I was already dressed. My roommate Becca was taking photos of me in my cap and gown in our apartment. I answered. My mother's voice. She said, "Honey, I am so sorry." I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "It's Meg." Meg had called the night before in a state. Meg and her boyfriend had had a fight and Meg was upset and Meg needed them to come. She said, "You know how Meg gets." I said, "Yes." I said, "I know how Meg gets." I said, "Yes." I said, "I know how Meg gets." She said, "We just felt we had to go to her." I said, "It's my graduation." She said, "I know, honey, and I am so sorry. Your father and I will take you to dinner next week to celebrate. I promise we'll make it up to you." I said, "Okay." I said it once. I did not say anything else. I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed in my cap and gown. Becca stood across the room with her phone still raised and her face doing the thing that faces do when they are trying to figure out how to respond to something they just witnessed. I said, "They're not coming." She sat down next to me. She put her arm around me. She said, "I'm here." I said, "I know." She said, "I will be your entire family today." I said, "Okay." She was. She cheered louder than anyone in that whole gymnasium. She took 47 photographs. She bought me flowers from a cart outside the venue and carried them while I carried my diploma, and she made it the day it was supposed to be in every way she possibly could. My parents called that evening. My mother said she was proud of me. My father said congratulations. They asked about the ceremony. I answered their questions. I was polite and I was fine. I had had years of practice being polite and fine. I drove back to Hartford 3 weeks later. We went to dinner at an Applebee's. My father gave me a card with $100 in it. My mother gave me a hug that lasted a long time. I sat across the table and looked at my parents and I thought, they love me. I believe that. They just love me from a distance that they have never noticed and have never thought to close. I drove back to Charlottesville. I started my career. I closed a door that I did not announce closing and which they never noticed was shut. The years after graduation built themselves in the way that years build themselves when you are doing work you care about and living a life that is genuinely yours. I got my master's in school counseling from Virginia at 24. I took a position at a middle school in Richmond. I was good at it immediately and better at it with every passing year, which is how it goes when you have chosen the right work for the right reasons. I bought a small house in Richmond at 27. I painted it myself. I planted a garden in the backyard that took 3 seasons to figure out and then became something I was genuinely proud of. I had a dog named Theodore who weighed 80 pounds and slept on my bed every night and whose opinion of me was consistently and unreasonably high. I had Becca, who had moved to DC for a job and who came to Richmond several weekends a year and with whom I had the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance because it was built on something solid from the beginning. I had a life. A real one. One I had built from the raw materials of myself rather than from anything my family had provided. My contact with my parents through these years was consistent in its pattern and in its limitations. I called on Sundays. The calls lasted 20 to 30 minutes. We covered the surface territory, my job, their retirement planning, Patrick's career, Meg's various situations, the neighborhood, the weather, the 1,000 small things that make up the visible portion of a family's life. I visited at Christmas and occasionally at Thanksgiving. I was present and polite and affectionate in the way that I genuinely felt affectionate. I was not performing a relationship I didn't have. I had a relationship with my parents. It just existed at a specific altitude and did not go lower than that, and we had all, without discussing it, accepted the altitude as the definition of the relationship. What I had not done was tell them about the graduation. I had not said, "You chose Meg's boyfriend drama over my graduation." I had not said, "I gave you 4 months of notice and 2 follow-up calls and you still didn't come." I had not said, $100 at Applebee's 3 weeks later is not the same thing as sitting in that gymnasium. I had said nothing. Because I had been saying nothing my entire life and the habit was deep and because saying something would have required them to hear something and I was not confident they would hear it and being not heard after the effort of speaking is worse than not speaking. So I said nothing. And the door stayed shut. And I watered my garden and walked Theodore and did my job and built my life, and they had no idea that anything had changed because the surface of our relationship looked exactly the same as it always had. I have to pause here. What do you think happened when my parents sent me that retirement party invitation? Option A, I went to the party and confronted them publicly. Option B, I ignored the invitation completely. Option C, I sent back the reply card with one quiet sentence and let that be the whole answer. Drop your answer in the comments. The retirement party invitation arrived on a Tuesday in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table grading student assessments when I heard the mail slot and went to pick up the pile and found the cream-colored envelope on top. My mother's handwriting. My name. Sarah Brennan, no middle initial, the way she had been writing my name my whole life. I opened it. Read the card. Looked at the reply card. Looked at the stamped envelope. I put everything back in the cream envelope and I set it on the corner of my kitchen table where I put things I need to think about and I went back to grading. I thought about it for 3 days. Not obsessively. I have done enough work on myself that I am not in the habit of obsessing over my parents' capacity to hurt me, which is a freedom that therapy and time and the building of a real life will eventually give you if you do the work. But I thought about it seriously, the way I think about serious things. With honesty and without the performance of a feeling I don't actually have. What I actually felt was tired. A quiet, specific, structural tiredness that had nothing to do with October or with work or with anything currently happening in my life. It was the tiredness of a pattern that has been running for decades without interruption and without anyone acknowledging that it is running. I also felt something else. A clarity that I had not quite had before. The invitation had made something visible that the Sunday phone calls and the Christmas visits had allowed to remain invisible, the assumption. My parents assumed I would come. They did not question it, did not consider that I might not, did not factor in that the relationship had a shape that perhaps did not obligate my attendance at their celebration in the way they believed it did. The assumption itself was the thing. The unexamined certainty that Sarah would be there because Sarah was always there, quiet and capable and fine, showing up as required. I picked up the reply card on Thursday evening. I sat at my kitchen table with Theodore at my feet and the garden visible through the back window, the late October version of it, mostly finished for the season, waiting for spring. I thought about what to write. Not a long explanation. An explanation would have required them to engage with the explanation, and I was not ready for that conversation, and was not sure I would ever be ready for it. Just something honest. Something that gave them the same energy they had given me. I wrote, "I'm so sorry, I can't make it." No reason. No elaboration. The same sentence my mother had said to me on the morning of my graduation, not those exact words, but that exact structure. A polite declining of a commitment they had expected me to honor, offered without explanation, with an implicit suggestion that other things had come up. I put it in the stamped envelope. I mailed it on Friday morning. I put it in the stamped envelope. I mailed it on Friday morning. Then I waited to see what would happen. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happened after I mailed that reply card is where this story gets complicated in ways I had not planned for. My mother called on Saturday. I answered. She said, "Honey, we got your reply card." She said it carefully, in the voice she uses when she is managing something. I said, "Yes." She said, "You can't make it?" I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." She said, "Sarah, it's our retirement party." I said, "I know. I'm sorry I can't be there." She said, "Can I ask why?" I said, "I just can't make it." I said it pleasantly. Evenly. The same tone that she had used on the morning of my graduation when she called at 7:15 to say that I know, honey, and I am so sorry, but Meg needs us. There was a pause on the phone. I could hear my mother working out what to say. She said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is fine." I said, "I hope the party is wonderful." I said it and I meant it. I bore them no ill will about the party itself, had no desire for it to go badly. I just wasn't going to be there. My father called that evening. This was unusual. My father calling me directly, without my mother, was a rare enough occurrence that the rarity itself communicated something. He said, "Sarah." I said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "Your mother is upset." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He said, "She doesn't understand why you're not coming to the party." I said, "I know." He said, "So why aren't you coming?" And then he said something else that surprised me. He said, "And I want a real answer, not the polite one." My father asking for a real answer was different. My father had spent 39 years accepting the polite version of everything I gave him and never asking for more. Something had shifted. I did not know yet what. I said, "Dad, do you remember my college graduation?" He was quiet. I said, "Do you remember calling me that morning?" Another quiet. Then he said, "We went to Meg." I said, "Yes." He said, "You never said anything about that." I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Because you were fine." I said, "Because I said I was fine." He said, "And you weren't." I said, "No." The line was quiet for long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. It hadn't. My father was still there. He said, "I didn't know you were still thinking about that." I said, "I have thought about it for 11 years, Dad. Not every day. But it has never fully gone away." He said, "Sarah, your mother and I we always thought you were the one who didn't need us as much." I said, "I know you thought that." He said, "Was that wrong?" I said, "Yes. It was wrong. Not because I needed you every moment, but because assuming someone doesn't need you is not the same as checking." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't know. But I needed you to come to my graduation, Dad. I had 2 months of notice, and I gave you 2 reminders, and you chose Meg's boyfriend drama over my graduation. And nobody ever said anything about it. Not me. Not you. Not Mom. We all just moved on. He said, and you've been carrying that. I said, I've been carrying a lot of things. He did not speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was different, quieter, less certain, the voice of a man who has realized that the floor under a conversation is further down than he thought. He said, I want to hear them. The things you've been carrying. Not on the phone. Can I come to Richmond? He came to Richmond on the following Saturday. By himself, he and my mother had discussed it, and they had decided, apparently, that my father coming alone was the right way to start. I do not know the details of that conversation. I know only that my father arrived at my door at 11 in the morning in his good coat, which is what he wears when something is important, and that he had driven 2.5 hours without telling me he was coming until the night before. I had cleaned the house. Not obsessively, but I had cleaned it the way you clean a space when you want someone to see that you have built a real life and not just an existence. Theodore greeted my father at the door with the cheerful indifference that large dogs apply to all humans, which broke some of the tension of the doorway. We sat in the living room. I made coffee. My father sat on the couch in his good coat, both hands around his mug, and he looked around my living room with the attention of someone who was seeing it for the first time, which he was. He had never been to my house. In 11 years of me living in Richmond, my parents had never visited. I had always gone to them. Another thing that had never been named. He said, "This is a good house." I said, "Thank you. I bought it 12 years ago." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "I know." He said, "Sarah." I said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me. Just tell me. What you've been carrying. I'll listen." I had been preparing for this conversation my entire life, and I had never prepared for it at all. The two things were both true simultaneously. I knew the content of everything I needed to say in the way that you know things you have thought about for years. I did not know how to say it to the actual man sitting across from me, which is the part that preparation cannot fully address. I started with the graduation because it was the clearest example. The one with the clearest beginning and middle and outcome. I told him what the morning had been like. The phone call at 7:15. The cap and gown. Becca's arm around me. The 47 photographs. The $100 bill in the card at Applebee's 3 weeks later. I told it without crying, not because I wasn't moved, but because I had processed it enough that the telling of it was no longer the same as the feeling of it. It was history now. True and important history. But history. My father listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend. When I finished, he said, "I am so sorry." Not the managed version. Not "I'm sorry you feel that way." Just "I am so sorry." 3 words. I said, "I know. I believe you." Then I told him the other things. Not everything, there was not enough time, and not all of it required saying. But the shape of things. The way attention had been distributed in our family. The pattern of fine and capable and not needing. The years of Sunday phone calls that never went below the surface. The Christmas visits where I sat at a table and watched my parents be fully present for Patrick's children and half present for everything else. The assumption that I would come to their retirement party without anyone asking whether coming still made sense, given the shape of our relationship. My father sat with all of it. He is not an expressive man, never has been, but I watched something move through him as I talked. Not drama. Something quieter. The particular discomfort of a person who is seeing something clearly for the first time that has been in front of them for years. When I finished, he said, "I don't know how to fix 39 years. I said, "I know." He said, "But I want to try and fix the next part. Whatever is left." I said, "Okay." He said, "What do you need from me?" Nobody in my family had ever asked me that question. What do you need from me? For words that had never been said in 39 years. I said, "I need you to show up. Not for the party. For the actual moments. I need a phone call sometimes that is about me and not about Patrick or Meg. I need you and Mom to come to Richmond. I need to not be the one who always travels in one direction. Small things. Nothing dramatic. Just show up." He said, "I can do that." I said, "I know it's late." He said, "Is late better than never?" I thought about my own answer honestly. I said, "Yes. Late is better than never. But it's not the same as on time." He said, I know. He said, I know it's not the same. We had lunch. We talked about other things for a while. Theodore sat on my father's feet, which Theodore does to people he has decided to accept. My father reached down and scratched behind his ears, and Theodore leaned into it with the devoted gratitude that dogs bring to everything. My father said, he's a good dog. I said, he's my best company. My father said, I'm glad you had him. He meant something more than the dog. I received it as more than the dog. My mother called 2 days after my father's visit. She had known he was coming. She had not called during the visit, which was the right call and showed more restraint than I expected. She called on Monday evening. I answered. She said, your father told me about your conversation. I said, okay. She said, he told me a lot. I said, good. She said, Sarah, I have been sitting with it since Saturday, and I don't know where to start. I said, start wherever you can. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the graduation. I should have been there. Your father should have been there. Meg needed us, but she stopped. She said, Meg always needed us. And we always went. And you never needed us, or we thought you didn't. And now I'm sitting here understanding that we made a choice every single time we chose to go toward the need that announced itself and away from the need that didn't. This was more than I had expected. My mother is not a woman who surfaces difficult truths easily. The fact that she was surfacing this one told me my father had come home from Richmond and had a real conversation with her. The kind of conversation they had probably needed to have for decades. I said, that's right. That's exactly what happened. She said, I am so sorry. I said, I know. She said, is there? She stopped. She said, is there anything left? Between us? Is there anything salvageable? Her voice on the word salvageable cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. I said, Mom, I didn't skip the retirement party to end the relationship. I skipped it because I needed you to notice that something had been wrong. She said, I noticed. I said, good. She said, I should have noticed sooner. I said, yes. You should have. She said, I know. We talked for an hour. The longest real conversation I had ever had with my mother. Not about Patrick. Not about Meg. About me, about them, about the shape of our family and the ways that shape had not served all of its members equally. My mother is a school administrator. She has spent her career building systems that are supposed to work for everyone in them. Sitting with the knowledge that the system of her own family had not worked for her middle child was, I could hear, genuinely difficult for her. Not impossible. Difficult. At the end of the call she said, we're not going to the party. I said, what? She said, we postponed it. Your father and I decided that having the party without you there was something we didn't want to do. I said, Mom, you don't have to do that. She said, we want to. We're going to do something smaller. Something different. When you're ready. And we'd like you to be at the center of it rather than at the edge. I sat with that for a moment. The center rather than the edge. 39 years of the edge, and my mother was saying, come to the center. I said, okay. She said, okay? I said, okay. Let me know when you're ready to plan it. She called me the following Sunday. And the Sunday after that. The calls lasted longer than they used to. They went below the surface. She asked questions and waited for the answers and asked follow-up questions that showed she had been listening to the first answers. It was imperfect. Decades of pattern do not dissolve in a few phone calls, and there were moments when I could feel us sliding toward the old format before one of us caught it and redirected. But we were trying. Both of us. In the halting, honest, genuinely effortful way that trying looks when it is real rather than performed. My parents came to Richmond in December. First time in 11 years of me living here. My father brought a bottle of wine. My mother brought food she had cooked and packed carefully, the kind of effort that is its own language. They walked through my house slowly, looking at everything. My mother stopped in the kitchen and looked at the photographs on the refrigerator, me and Becca at various points over 20 years, Theodore at multiple ages, a few from work events, a picture of my garden in its best summer. She said, this is a full life. I said, it is. She said, we should have been in more of these pictures. I said, yes. You should have. It has been 8 months since I mailed the reply card. 8 months is not enough time to undo 39 years, and I am not trying to undo them. What I am trying to do, and what my parents are trying to do with varying degrees of success and occasional backsliding, is build something different in the time that remains. My mother calls every Sunday now, sometimes twice a week. The calls are real in the way they were not real before. She asks about my students, remembers details I told her the previous week, asks follow-up questions that show she was listening. Last month she asked about a student I had mentioned. A quiet 7th grader I had been keeping an eye on. She remembered his name. She asked how he was doing. I told her he was doing better, that I had connected him with some resources, that he had started opening up a little. She said, "You're good at that. Seeing the ones who are quiet." I said, "I had practice." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know. I know you did. My father calls on Thursdays. Short calls mostly. My father is not built for long phone calls, and I have accepted this rather than wishing he were different. He asks about the garden. He asks about Theodore. He told me last week that he had been reading about school counseling, just general reading, he said, because he wanted to understand better what I actually did every day. I said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I wanted to." I said, "What did you learn?" He said, that it's harder than it looks and more important than most people understand. I said, "Yes, that's exactly right." He said, "You've been doing important work, Sarah." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I should have said that sooner." I said, "Yes, but you said it now." The retirement party happened in February. Not at the country club. In my parents' house in West Hartford, small and informal, about 30 people rather than 120. Patrick was there with his family. Meg was there. I was there. I flew up on a Friday and stayed the weekend. My mother had set the table with care. My father had made a grocery run that morning for things he knew I liked. Small gestures. Visible effort. After dinner, my father made a toast. He is not a toast-making man, and he had clearly thought about this one. He thanked my mother for 41 years. He thanked Patrick and Meg, and then he said, "And I want to thank Sarah, who taught me this year that showing up matters, and that showing up late is better than not showing up. And that it is never too late to start paying better attention." He looked at me when he said it. I looked back. I did not cry. I came close. My mother hugged me at the end of the evening. A real hug, longer than the polite ones that had been her previous language. She said into my shoulder, "I'm sorry it took so long." I said, "I know." I said, "I'm glad we got here." She said, "So am I." I drove to the airport the next morning. I sat at the gate with my coffee and I thought about the gymnasium in Charlottesville 11 years ago. Becca's arm around me. The 47 photographs. The drive back alone. And then I thought about the dinner table the night before. My father's toast. My mother's hug. The house full of people who were imperfect in all the ways that families are imperfect and who had shown up. Some of them had showed up late. But they had shown up. And Becca, who had been there from the beginning, texted me from DC while I was at the gate. "How did it go?" I texted back, "Better than expected." She sent back 3 words, "I told you." I smiled. She had. She had told me for years that my parents were capable of more than they had shown me. I had doubted it. She had been right. I have been a school counselor for 14 years. In that time I have worked with hundreds of students. The ones I think about most are not the ones with the loudest needs or the most dramatic situations. They are the quiet ones. The self-sufficient ones. The ones that teachers describe as fine. The ones who have learned to make themselves small enough to fit into the space that is available for them, which is often much smaller than the space they actually require. I know what that is. I know what it costs. I know the particular discipline of needing less so that the need doesn't exceed the available supply, and I know what that discipline does to a person over years and decades. It makes you competent and independent and a little lonely in a specific way that is hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. And it makes you very good, eventually, at recognizing the same thing in other people. Especially in 12 and 13-year-olds who are sitting in classrooms being fine while something underneath the fine is asking a question that nobody is hearing. I sit with those students. I ask them what they actually need, which is a question that surprises most of them because they are not used to being asked. I give them time to answer, which they also need because people who have learned to need less don't answer that question quickly. They have to remember that answering is allowed. My parents are retired now. They are building the next chapter that the gold-lettered card promised, with more presents in it than the previous chapters had offered. My mother has started coming to Richmond twice a year. My father came in the spring and helped me build a raised bed in the garden that I had been planning for 2 years and hadn't gotten around to doing alone. He is not a man of many words. He is a man who will drive 2 hours to build a raised bed with his daughter, which is its own kind of word. Patrick and I have gotten closer. Without the pressure of family occasions as the primary context for our relationship, without performing normalcy at Christmas tables, we have discovered that we actually like each other, which is a nicer thing than being obligated to each other. He told me recently that he had not known, growing up, the shape of what was happening in our family. That he had been the focus without understanding that focus was being taken from somewhere. He said, "I'm sorry if I took up too much space." I said, "You didn't take it. It was given to you." He said, "I should have noticed anyway." I said, "Maybe. But you're noticing now." He said, "Better late than never." I said, "That seems to be the theme of this year." Meg is a more complicated story, and I am not going to resolve it here because complicated stories do not resolve on timelines of convenience. She and I are in contact. The contact is careful and has a specific shape to it that we have both, without discussing it, agreed to honor. I do not resent Meg. She did not choose to be the fragile youngest any more than I chose to be the invisible middle. We were both placed in our positions by a family system that was doing its imperfect best, and we are both adults now living with the results of that. I do not hold my parents' failures against them in the ongoing way that holding things against people requires. That kind of holding is expensive, and I have better things to spend my energy on. What I hold is the truth of what happened, not to punish them with it, but because the truth of what happened is part of my story and my story belongs to me, and I am not interested in revising it into something easier to carry for their benefit. My parents didn't come to my graduation. I didn't go to their retirement party. And then my father drove 2.5 hours to my house in his good coat and asked for a real answer and listened to it. And my mother called on a Monday evening and said the word salvageable in a cracking voice. And they came to Richmond in December for the first time in 11 years and brought wine and food and looked at the photographs on my refrigerator and saw, maybe for the first time clearly, the full life I had built without them. Late, but present. Finally present. That is not everything. It is not the childhood I needed or the parents I sometimes wished I had. It is what they were capable of becoming, which turned out to be more than I had stopped expecting and less than I had always hoped, and somewhere between those two things is where the real relationship lives now. My name is Sarah Brennan. I am 39 years old. I am a school counselor in Richmond, Virginia. I have a house and a garden and a dog named Theodore who thinks I am the most important person in the world, which I find both absurd and completely sustaining. My parents didn't come to my graduation. I didn't go to their retirement party. And then we both stopped pretending that was fine. That's not revenge. It is not karma exactly either. It is just what happens when the quiet child finally takes up the space she was always supposed to have. Better late than never. But let the record show, on time would have been better.